Very much. And I have to apologise, I don't look as nearly as nice as that today because I'm feeling quite rubbish due to a cold, thanks to my new husband sharing that with me. Um, wish me luck. But welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back after lunch to watch my talk. And I hope that what I have to talk about today will be of interest and that maybe you will contact me after today and we could potentially work together. That would be amazing. As mentioned, my name is Molly, now Molly Barnes, and I am on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm still as Molly Watt, though. Sorry, Max. I will always be Molly Watt, I think. I work at a web design agency where we do research, development, and design of websites, all things digital, but we're a very human-centered company. So we're all about the people-first approach. And Nexa Digital is actually part of a larger Swedish organization called Nexa Group. So I'm not sure if you've heard of that. This QR code is my LinkedIn profile. It will come up again at the end if you were still interested in keeping in contact. But that is who I am. So today we're going to talk about inclusion and accessibility. And typically when we mention accessibility, people think disability. So yes, we're going to talk a little bit about disabilities first, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself, and then hopefully I'll have some constructive advice for you all from today to go away and apply into your own roles. So, in the world, there is 1.3 billion people living with a long-term disability. In the UK, where I'm from, it's 16 million people, so that's 1 in 5 people. Now, interestingly, I've been using similar variations of this slide deck for a long time, and these numbers have just gotten bigger and bigger, interestingly, since COVID. So more people are diagnosed with disabilities as a result of COVID, or I'm not sure why else, but the number's gotten bigger, so there's more of us with a disability. Breaking it down across, Europe, we have various countries shown here, and it's that similar 20% mark across countries, but taking into account the ratio of population and how big countries are. It's very similar, I would say, in terms of how many people are registered with a disability. Now, when we talk about accessibility and more so inclusion, we are not just talking about people with disabilities. People assume that because accessibility must equal disability, right? But actually, there's a lot of people with access needs that are not diagnosed with a disability. They might have an impairment or a temporary or situational need. That does mean they have challenges accessing their environment online or offline. There are also people that go their entire lives waiting for a diagnosis. It's ironically a very inaccessible. Can you see me? Because I just realised how tall this podium is. I'm quite short. So ironically, a lot of people wait their entire lives for a diagnosis. So therefore, they have access needs, and they don't have access to the support and tools in order for them to actually live a good life. So actually, that's when I like to talk more about inclusion, because we need to think about the people that we're actually designing for. Now, the company that I just mentioned that I work in the UX, the user experience design team. So as I mentioned, we have a very human-first approach. We work with a lot of actual people, usability labs, and so on. But I kind of fell into accessibility through my own life experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. So yes, that is me. What happened? I know, she was very cute once. So I was born deaf, and I was given my first pair of hearing aids at 18 months old. And this is me at about 3 years old, and I'm wearing a box like harness with all the wires because that was the tech that was available during that time. I had a very happy childhood being a deaf child. I was one of 4 kids, and the other 3 were fine. It was just my luck being deaf. I was not able to speak until I was 6 years old. So along with speech therapy and great support from my family and the school at the time, I was eventually able to speak from the age of 6, which in hindsight feels like really late, but actually for a deaf person, it's really hard work. You need the hearing aid technology, you need lots and lots of one-on-one time and dedication to really get access to that communication. So I'm now 29 and I've not stopped talking since, uh, unfortunately for you, Max. um, and anyway, had a really, really happy childhood despite being deaf. Then I got to the trickier ages, the hormonal ages, dare I say, 11, 12 years old, where I was starting to struggle a little bit more. And it wasn't just the hormonal stuff, that was bad enough, but I was struggling to lip read, and I was struggling to read the board in the classroom, and I was clumsier, and I was struggling with headaches. And it was actually my teacher of the deaf at the time who used to visit me twice a term at school. And she said to me, Molly, you might need reading glasses. It's not unusual for deaf people to experience such exhaustion, because the saying goes, deaf people hear with their eyes is so true. Whether it's sign language, lip patterns, facial expressions, gestures, everything's very visual. So I went for a routine eye check, just a normal Vision Express in my local town. And it was actually the optician in that shop that day who said to my parents, do you know why Molly is deaf? Very strange question to be asked in the opticians. And my parents said, well, no, we were told it was just a technical blip. We don't have any family history in deafness. It is what it is. And he turned around and said, well, I think there's something not quite right at the back of Molly's eyes, and I think it's linked to her deafness. So went to several hospital appointments, ended up at Moorfield Eye Hospital in London, which is one of the top 10 hospitals in the world, and I received a new diagnosis, Usher syndrome. Now, Usher syndrome is the most common cause of congenital deaf blindness. So never did I imagine walking into that optician's that day that I was going to walk out with the prospect of going blind. It was quite terrifying. But this was actually a condition I was born with. But there were no clues to the eye earlier on, because I had all the normal tests as a baby and passed them all except for the ears. But it reared its ugly head, if you like, when I was 11 or 12. I started experiencing visual differences. And they said the retinitis pigmentosa, also known as RP, is a very common progressive blindness. And they said to my parents, Molly shouldn't experience too much of a deterioration in her vision until she's in her late 20s, early 30s. Well, I went from being partially sighted at the age of 12 to severely sight impaired, politically correct for blind at the age of 14. So I now have a useful 5 degrees vision in one eye, explains the cane. I normally have a very beautiful guide dog, but she is not here because traveling with a guide dog, unfortunately, is too complicated and very inaccessible, a lot of paperwork involved. So I use this very ugly cane instead, and my husband. Also not as pretty as my guide dog. Love you, Max. Anyway, moving on swiftly. So I wanted to draw an interpretation of how I actually see, because I don't know if any of you have been to a workshop or been to an event where there's been some stimulation goggles to interpret how some blind people see. And they are good to an extent, but they are not realistic. They're not 100% realistic. So I painted my own using my iPad Pro, Apple Pencil, Procreate app. And I took a picture of my beautiful guide dog, and I've drawn an overlay to try and illustrate how I see. Because a lot of people, even in 2023, assume that blind people see nothing. However, 93% of blind people have some useful vision. The remaining 7% don't have any useful vision. They might see light and dark, but that's it. So for me, I have my useful 5 degrees in the middle, and that can shrink sometimes depending on how bright it is, how dark it is. For example, I am night blind, so right now can't see a thing. I'm talking to myself right now, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also glare blind as well, so when it's really bright and sunny. And then in the edges, it's kind of this very heavy black fog. if you like. So it's not like black. People say, is it just black where your vision's gone? No, it's just like this heavy fog with some blind spots, because sometimes I can see something down here and I'm like, what's that? My eye's tricking me. But it's floaters and flashing lights and so on. So hopefully, excuse the pun, that's opened your eyes to how some people can see. I've also taken this overlay and I've put it on a website so you can start to see the user experience of someone with retinitis pigmentosa. Of course, not everyone's experience is exactly the same, but when thinking about navigation and pop-up messages and things like that, you can quickly understand how tricky it can be. And also colour. Colour is essential, the contrast levels. I'm very reliant and dependent on my central vision because ironically, being born a deaf person, I'm still a very visual person, even as a blind person. So if I had a penny for every time someone said to me, "You're not blind, you're looking straight at me," I'd be a very rich person. I would not need to work. So it's really about understanding the grey areas within the disabled communities. And one of the reasons why I talk about my own experiences as an accessibility consultant and specialist in UX and user experience is because I think a lot of people overlook people's experiences with disabilities. People stereotype when they've heard or they've met one deaf person, they assume that every deaf person is going to be the same, and the same with blind people. And one of the biggest things people overlook is whether or not that person's been born with a disability or acquired it. And truth be told, the majority of the disabled population have acquired disabilities. So they were born fully abled and then acquired something. Particularly in the blind community, the majority of us have progressively lost vision. So I can still remember colours and things like that, but I may not be able to access them as well as I do now. If you put me next to someone who was born with useful 5 degrees vision like myself, you can guarantee the way I access my everyday environment, my tools, online, offline, you can guarantee the way we experience the world is actually very different. Person being born blind probably uses Braille, is probably a whiz at screen reader technology. And a lot of people, particularly in the tech industry, are very surprised when I say I don't rely on a screen reader. I use a lot of visual tools, so magnification, color alterations, color filters, and I do use screen readers, but I don't depend on it. I use them on my very bad days. So it's understanding the different experiences within a community. It's very complex and it's not black and white. But anyone can have challenges. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, when we talk about accessibility, we're not just talking about people like me. We're talking about people who wear glasses, for instance. Glasses are a form of assistive technology because they are there to assist you to see, whether it's driving, reading, long-sighted, short-sighted. Without those, you have got access needs. And what really surprises me is how so many apps and websites are not compatible with the text resizing tools. When I think about my parents, they're in their late 50s, early 60s, and they have their text size on their phone bigger than I have mine, and I'm blind. What's that about, right? Yet so many apps are not compatible with that large text function. So on iOS and Android, if you go into settings and you set your text size as larger, your texts and your emails and so on will automatically change size. But what should happen when you download an app is that it automatically changes size. But it doesn't do that. It's very, very rare that that actually happens. And by 45, most of us will need glasses. So that's just one example, right? Disability is far more common than we may think. There are many people that have invisible disabilities. They may choose not to tell people, or they may not feel comfortable they can tell people depending on their environment, who they work with, and so on. When we are thinking about accessibility in our users, we do have 5 different components. There's actually a 6th one, which I'll add. I was meant to update this earlier and I forgot. But visual, auditory, sensory motor, speech, and cognitive. And underneath are a few examples of the long-term impairments, disabilities. And then along the bottom are experiences and situations that I'm pretty sure a lot of you have experienced, where you find yourselves having a challenge accessing something. So, for example, if you've forgotten your glasses, how do you then access your emails? Do you pinch Zoom, or do you just squint and give yourself a headache? Auditory, when you're in a loud, noisy environment and you're trying to communicate with people around you, how do you deal with that? Sensory motor is an interesting one. When you're out food shopping and you might have your little toddler with you, or you're holding something in one hand and you're food shopping with the other hand, you are temporarily impaired because you are using one hand. An interesting form of inclusive design that we have in one of our Swedish offices is we recognise a situation where people were struggling, and it was going into meetings. People would have their laptop and their coffee, and to open the door, it was really hard because their hands were full. And so what they did is they built a little mini shelf outside of the door so you could sit your coffee on it, open the door, and then take your coffee and walk into the office or into the meeting. And that was a really interesting way of understanding the situation and people involved and how that can better be inclusive. Other examples, I've been to Microsoft events where you have elevators and not everyone can access the buttons. So there were buttons for the lift to open the doors on the floor, so you could use your foot instead of your hands if your hands were full or if you were unable to use them for whatever reason. Really interesting. And then with speech in the day of Alexa, Siri, and so on, there are many different situations there, whether a disability or temporary, where a lot of us might have experienced some challenge, whether you've lost your voice, laryngitis, so on. Cognitive, one that's arguably quite overlooked, but hopefully with the new web accessibility guidelines coming through, hopefully there'll be more a focus on those. But I can pretty much guarantee most of us know someone who's got ADHD or dyslexic or whatever. That can really impair your experience when online. You can be easily distracted. It can be a cognitive overload when booking flights and you're worried that you've put in the wrong details and you can't find the flight number. I get particularly anxious, and I'm sure the next person with a cognitive impairment would as well. So many things to consider, and of course these are not all of it, there's a lot more. But ultimately, it's understanding that we are all different, even within different communities. Because accessibility should not be considered as an afterthought, or as help, but as reasonable adjustments for us all. Because ultimately, we're all going to benefit from it at some point in our lives. So, what is the best way to design for inclusion? Has anybody here heard of the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? I'm so glad you remembered I'm deaf and you shouted at me, because that's brilliant. Amazing. So it's good you've heard of them. And they are very much worth knowing about, of course, because it's divided into different categories: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, also known as poor. So when we analyse a website and we are trying to understand how well your website is behaving, we look at these different things. But the one thing I will say, although this is an international recognised set of guidelines, great to know about, but not the be-all, end-all, certainly not a place to start and end. You must continue from that, and I'll explain that in a moment. Because the best examples of accessible and inclusive services are made for people's needs. You're involving people and not just a checklist approach. An example of this is this was a sign that was put on Virgin trains in the UK. And I'll describe it for you. So these were signs that were put outside of toilets on a train. And it says, door locked when lit. Yeah, I'm glad someone's getting it already. Door unlocked when lit, and then door locked when lit. And underneath, you've got some Braille. yes, so I'm hoping, again, by that reaction, you know exactly what I'm going to say. What the company has got is they've looked at the checklist and they've gone, oh, we need to make sure our labels are fully accessible to blind people. I know, let's put Braille on all of our labels. Tick, done. But they have not understood the context, they've not understood the users at all. Because if someone is using Braille, it's likely they don't have any light perception. So they will not know whether the door is locked or unlocked because they won't be able to see when it's lit. And I don't know about you, but going to the toilet on the train is a very nerve-wracking experience anyway, isn't it? Let alone if you have a disability. So this is why we must read on from the checklist approach. We have to learn more from the communities, involve people in testing, and so on. So let's normalize inclusive design, because when we get it right, it becomes invisible. And one of the very early on forms of accessibility is volume. We don't think twice about changing our volume to suit us, whether it's too quiet and we can't hear it, or whether it's too noisy in the background and we can't hear it. We adjust it so we can better access it. So that is a normalized form of accessibility that not only benefits someone like me who's deaf, but benefits you all depending on your situation. Another example, Pinch Zoom. Who here uses Pinch Zoom? If you didn't say yes, you're lying. Everyone uses Pinch Zoom. I remember when Instagram first came out and you could not Pinch Zoom. And so for the first year or so, I could not use this app. All my friends were using it, but I could not use it because I could not Pinch Zoom. But I will often see people now Pinch Zooming in on their phones. I've heard funny stories of people that have kids where they've tried to Pinch Zoom on the TV screen. So they've gotten so used to that notion of pinching to just see something better. But also when you're on the web and you're trying to tick a box and the box is too small and you Pinch Zoom to try and get it a bit bigger so you can tick that box. Captions. Who uses captions? Yes. Again, if you said no, you're lying. Most people I find, particularly in the tech industry, tend to use captions. I'm also hearing that children will use captions, and it's actually quite good for them because their reading concentration is improved and so on. But one of the things about captions is that you can access a video without having to go into it and listen to it. So this lady, in her situation, she's on the underground, she's holding on, it's very noisy on the underground, so she probably can't hear the video, and she's also holding her phone with one hand, so her mobility is also a little bit restricted, but she's still able to digest that whole content of a video through captions. Now, one of the talks I did talking about this and raving about it, someone argued that this was more Facebook and marketing. But I argued back that actually, irrespective of whether it's for marketing purposes or not, it's still accessible. It means that I can access videos should I not want to tap into it. Also, if you're in the office and you shouldn't be on YouTube and you're watching funny cat videos, you can still access the video with just captions. So what can we all do to be more digitally inclusive? So often when we think about different devices, we think about the screen size first. So, of course, there's lots of different devices out there, all different sizes. But we need to consider how people are interacting with these devices. And a lot of people with access needs and without use it in different ways for different reasons. So with voice, touch and gestures, input devices, pointing devices, a lot of the input devices like screen readers and so on, they are all used through using a keyboard. So it's knowing if you can navigate through a website using your keyboard alone, for instance. But also when you're using your handheld device, designing for comfort. As time's gone on, we know the screens have changed drastically. And of course, within the green, we've got the natural reaching for the thumb area, and then we've got the stretch and the ow. And what I find now is I see a lot more people using their phones with two hands. And what that means, they're looking at their phone using two hands, and they will walk into me and my guide dog because they're not looking where they're going. But that's because there's not as much comfort when using their devices. But also when thinking about navigation on apps and on the web. I think as screens have gotten bigger, particularly with Safari on iOS, the navigation has moved to the bottom so that you can easily reach it. There are also accessibility features where you can move the screen down by swiping the page down, I think, and you can access it better with one hand. Design for legibility and readability. So that clear understanding in more ways than one. You know, the clear visual hierarchy, headings, short sentences. Consider your user's reading age. So typically we think about 7, 8-year-old for reading age. Sounds young, but actually you're targeting a wider audience by doing that. And it makes it more accessible, more usable, and more readable. Design for the full spectrum of your users. Now, one of the things that we always recommend when you're in your early stages of testing for accessibility, for instance, you've done your WCAG, you've looked at all the guidelines, but now you've got to do some manual testing because that's where you're going to find actual issues, is test that website using a tab key. Who here uses a tab key when using a form? See, I knew you wouldn't let me down. All you techies out there, it's all about that tab key. How annoying is it when that doesn't work? Very annoying. And so think of that from a screen reader perspective. They're tabbing through, and not all of the interactive elements are accessible by the tab key. So therefore, they can't interact, they can't proceed in their journey. So that's a very quick and easy way to start testing your website, tabbing through and seeing, is the order understandable? Does it make sense? Is everything accessible via a keyboard? And so on. Now, I talk a lot about tech and how amazing it is from my own personal experience, and I've given you a couple very vague tips. But it's also good to understand that technology isn't everything. We cannot forget people, and I'm going to give you an example now. So, as I mentioned, I was born deaf, and I was given my first pair of hearing aids at 18 months old. And then when I got to the age of 9 or 10, I got my first pair of digital hearing aids. And I remember this day so well because it was the day I heard birds singing for the first time and the rustling of my jacket when I was pulling the zip up on my coat. I heard that. And then when I got to about 20, 21 years old, I was introduced to smart hearing aids. So not only was the quality of sound better, the clarity of sounds better, it came with an app because everything has an app now. Why not have an app for your deafness? Now, this is brilliant. However, the app is inaccessible. It is laughable, really, but at the same time, it's if you don't laugh, you cry sort of moment. So I have this app, which is, there's some things I can use on it, don't get me wrong, but the best features on this app I cannot use because it is inaccessible. So basically, it's all through Bluetooth, so I can, stream music, make phone calls. I made my first phone call when I was 20 years old, which is insane. Like that was the first time I made my first phone call to my granddad, and I heard his voice going down my ear canal. Very strange experience, but great. But with the app, there's other features. So I can adjust the bass sounds and the treble sounds and the middle sounds. I can adjust the background noise to focus on the person in front of me. I can apply location services. So if I go to the same cafe every day and I've made some changes, the next time I walk into that cafe, the hearing aids will automatically change because it's remembered the settings I changed it to. Amazing. There's also a wind reduction mode, which is really great because as hearing aid users, often when you're outside and it's windy, you imagine a microphone and find it, and you hear this like interference all the time from the wind. That's what you hear as a hearing aid user. It's really, really frustrating. But on the iPhone, on the app, you can reduce that wind reduction, so then you can hear cars and so on. When I got these hearing aids, actually, just through the hearing aid technology and not the app, the main thing I noticed was the location. I could actually understand where noises were coming from. Before, with my other hearing aids, it just amplified sound. I could just hear things louder. But this time, I could actually hear where people's voices were coming from. So if I was in a meeting and we were all sitting around a big table, although I couldn't see them, I could hear roughly where they were coming from, so I could turn to face them. Also, from a safety aspect, when I was walking down a street one day with my first guide dog, we were walking down, we walked really quite fast actually, and Eunice, that was her name, granny name, I know, but that was her name, she abruptly stopped. And I remember thinking, why has she stopped? And I looked round, and there was a big truck that was pulling out of the road onto the road, and it was about an inch away from my face. The reason I didn't hear it, because I heard there was a beeping sound and so on, but I didn't know where or how close that danger was. So had I not have had my guide dog that day, I would have been under there, or my cane would have gone under there and I would have been severely injured. So now with these hearing aids, I can walk down the road and I can hear where cars are coming from. Or if I'm walking down the street and someone's called out my name, I can hear roughly where they're coming. So it makes me feel so much safer. That's amazing. But back to the app. The last experience on here, which is meant to be the best one, but I can't experience, is you fill in a little form. So backtrack a bit. So before COVID, I traveled around a lot, doing these kind of things, keynotes, talks, and working with other companies globally. And should one of my hearing aids break, which as you can imagine would be very, very stressful because I am deeply dependent on my hearing aids, I'd be very, very stressed. But with this app, what I can do is I can fill in a little form, talk about exactly what went wrong with this hearing aid. Is it making any noises? Blah, blah, blah. Just fill in all the details. This form gets sent to an external audiologist, and then within 48 hours, so sometimes a little bit of a wait, they'll pull up my audiogram, have a look at my notes, and then they make a couple of changes in my audiogram, and then they send it back to me, and I receive a notification on my phone, just like a software update, if you like. I take my hearing aid out, the broken hearing aid, scan it next to my phone, and it reinstalls the software and it fixes it. Oof. That's incredible. So I could be anywhere in the world, and one of my hearing aids would break, an audiologist could fix it. So the only problem is this whole form, like the colors, I can't zoom in, the text size doesn't get any bigger, I can't access it. I know how cool it is, but I can't use it. And this is one of the very common situations where you would expect a company to be considerate of accessibility, have it embedded in everything they do, but they have not built with accessibility for a hearing aid app, which is a bit strange. And they probably think stereotypically, oh, we're just designing for deaf people. Deaf people have perfect eyes, very unrealistic. A lot of deaf people wear glasses, a lot of us also get older, and the aging population, we all acquire something. So there is every need to be designing for better inclusion. So this is where I say assistive technology just cannot work on its own. You have to have people involved all the way through. You have to listen to communities, get in touch with communities, user testing, all of the rest. Do the research. Because everybody will experience a real need for inclusive services at least once in their lives. So services, products, so on. Consider everybody's journey. Shameless plug here. So if you are looking at starting your journey, or you've started your journey in accessibility, and this is one of the things a lot of people and a lot of clients I talk to, they're scared and they don't know where to start. But starting somewhere will make a huge difference to even a small group of people. And once you've started, you can't stop. You're never going to please everybody. You're never going to be fully accessible. Accessibility is a constant learning curve. I'm still learning. But one of the things that we do, we deliver inclusive design workshops, we do audits and reports and things like that. But we've also done procurement processes as well. So we looked at all the tools that you are working with and external clients as well. And it's also about from within, like within the company, are you recruiting diverse, inclusive groups, people, and do you want to? Do you want to invest in that culture? Let me know. Here I am on LinkedIn if you do want to reach out after today. I will be around a little bit longer today, but as I mentioned earlier, I do feel a little bit crap and I don't want to share more germs than I need to. But please don't hesitate to reach out after today should you have any questions. Thank you so much for having me.